As the Donroe doctrine takes a firmer hold in Latin America, what will become of Cuba and Venezuela? President Trump said Washington will run Caracas, but after two major earthquakes lead to a state of emergency, will U.S. control be put to the test? And will new sanctions alongside Cuba's economic reforms prevent Havana from suffering Venezuela's fate? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is the Newsmakers. It was already a confusing picture in Latin America after the shocking U.S. arrest, some say kidnapping, of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. Now, while Maduro was removed by force, democratic elections across the continent have ushered in right-wing politicians amenable to President Trump's interventionist policy. As for Cuba, it's fitting that the nation is an island because it finds itself more isolated and alone than ever. Hoping to avoid Maduro's fate, its leaders are now instituting unprecedented free market reforms while facing increased U.S. sanctions. So can Cuba and the principles of its revolution survive? And what's the future of Venezuela? Here's a look.
Rescuers dig through rubble in Venezuela after twin earthquakes cause widespread devastation. Interim President Delcy has declared a national emergency, and President Donald Trump said the US is ready to help its new and great friends. Washington's capture of Nicolas Maduro in January after accusing him of running a drug cartel has left Venezuela with unelected leadership, managing maximum US pressure, a dire economic situation, and now a deadly disaster. Since taking charge, Rodriguez has opened Venezuela's oil sector to US companies. Now, its exports primarily go to the US and India, with profits held by the US Treasury. And Trump touts the economic gains.
We've paid for the cost of the war, where do you hear this? 28 times already. More, but 28 times. So the cost of the war, we've already, because we brought millions of barrels of oil out, and we're getting along great. The people running it, they're our people, they're great people.
Not every Venezuelan agrees. Calls for the release of all political prisoners are growing. And in early June, thousands marched to the US Embassy in Caracas, demanding free elections.
The interim period of a transition that no one elected is coming to an end. We Venezuelans hope for democracy, justice, and freedom.
In a positive step, the government held its first US-backed dialogue with opposition figures last week to discuss the democratic transition. But there is no clear roadmap, and the promised economic revival has yet to materialize for Venezuelans. With Maduro's ouster, Cuba has lost its lifeline for oil and money. President Trump has called the island a threat to US security.
We have some very good plans for Cuba. I think, we have to get rid of the regime was very tough, very nasty. The difference is now they don't have money coming in.
And the decades-long US embargo and tightened sanctions are deepening the already severe economic crisis. The country is struggling with prolonged blackouts, food and water shortages, and collapsing health services as the US oil embargo that began in February bites harder. Lately, Washington imposed new sanctions on Cuban companies vital to the island's economy to ramp up pressure to make a deal with the US. In search of a remedy to the crisis, the government announced unprecedented free market reforms last week. The sweeping measures aim to reduce the state's control over the economy and create more space for private business.
Cuba changes to rise. Cuba changes to live better. Cuba changes to continue being free. History taught us to resist. This time demands that we transform. And we are going to transform with the people, for the people, and by the people.
Cubans hope the reforms bring much-needed relief.
We hope they work out because measures are being taken, so let's see if we can breathe a little.
Something has to happen because we can't keep living like this. We are starving.
Mexico also seeks to resume oil shipments to Cuba, which were halted after Trump threatened tariffs on countries supplying the island. Cuba's survival grows more tied to Washington's mercy. And as Trump keeps gaining allies in the region, pushing back against US dominance seems more difficult than ever.
So as Latin America polarizes, can revolutionary ideology survive, and what role will the U.S. play? Joining me now to debate that and more are from Oxford, Senior Director for Policy at the International Crisis Group, Ivan Briscoe. From Miami, Republican strategist and Miami Republican committeewoman, Angie Wong. And from New York, Executive Director of the People's Forum, Manolo De Los Santos. Thank you all so much for being with me. Ivan, I'll start with you. I have to start, of course, with Venezuela, especially given the urgency of these twin earthquakes. This is a country the U.S. declared that it was in charge of just a few months ago. So other than the immediate humanitarian relief, what kind of challenges could this disaster present for Washington?
I mean, first of all, our thoughts have to go out to the Venezuelans who've suffered these earthquakes. The images that we've seen are appalling. The news that we're getting from people in Caracas and on the coastal areas is that it's been devastating, and we don't have any idea of what the scale of the death toll will be at the end. It will be a lot higher than what we have at the moment. There's no doubt about that. So that's first and foremost. And I think we've already seen lots of countries, including, of course, the US, responding with offers of aid and support. But there's no doubt that it does raise questions about what the US role precisely in Venezuela is now. Because we know very well about the US Special Forces operation to capture Nicolas Maduro in January. We know that the government of Delcy Rodriguez is effectively, in some ways, a protectorate. It is being overseen by the United States. The United States is handling the oil exports and the revenues coming in from those exports. It's spreading its influence all over the country, but it doesn't have a formal role. Mm-hmm. And without a formal role, it doesn't actually have responsibility for what happens in Venezuela. The government of Delcy Rodriguez is still the sovereign state in that country. And so now we are going to see in this sort of after this terrible disaster, whether the United States is going to assume wider responsibilities, and that obviously includes caring and tending and protecting the people, because Venezuela has suffered an earthquake, but at the end of years of economic collapse, of a humanitarian disaster, of mass emigration, the needs were huge before the earthquake, and they're only going to be bigger now. So the question is, will the United States really step up, given this is the same government which obviously eradicated its principal source of development funding for Latin America and the world, USAID, at the start of last year?
Yeah, let me ask Angie then what your take on this is. Because if the U.S. declared it was in charge, they not only have to consider what the cost of emergency relief will be, but of rebuilding as well. Because President Trump has very proudly said that the United States is profiting from Venezuela's oil revenues. So these are serious costs that will be incurred in the recovery process from these disasters. How is the U.S. going to manage that?
The Venezuelan community here in Miami at a local coffee shop where I agree with my co-panelist, Ivan. They were complaining that because of decades of decay and underdevelopment, a lot of their bridges, their roads, their hospitals even collapsed because of just poor infrastructure and no maintenance. And many in the community here in Miami were blaming President Trump's removal of U.S. aid from financing some of these much-needed projects. They were completely dependent on a lot of U.S. money for their infrastructure. So I would imagine after the emergency aid that both President Trump and Secretary of State Marco Rubio have promised today to send over relief, as well as search and rescue teams. There will be rebuilding. There will be infrastructure improvements. There will be funds allocated to that, at least for the short term. And I think that is, part of the U.S.'s job as the caretaker in Venezuela now that there is just an interim president and things are in flux. But no doubt, let's rescue those who are alive and who survived this. Let's take care of the wounded first, and then we'll worry about rebuilding later.
Of course. I mean, that's why I said other than the immediate humanitarian aid, which is obvious, and everyone is hoping to be able to help in this case. I mean, Angie, does the U.S. Do they want this responsibility? Because effectively, they have taken this on.
We can take on this responsibility. I don't think that this is going to be a deterrent in any way. We are effectively the de facto caretaker of this country while it's in flux with its government. It's a matter of going to Congress now and asking for allocations. I'm sure there are emergency funds that will support some of the rebuilding efforts, but the long-term effects of it, you are talking to a developer who is also the president of the United States. I mean, this is also, unfortunately, an opportunity to rebuild a lot of the aging infrastructure of that country.
Okay, let me get Manolo's opinion on the analyses you've heard.
Well, I'm shocked that my co-panelists obviously have addressed the scale of the disaster the country is facing, but have refused to mention, I think, the biggest question facing Venezuela's recovery and response to this natural disaster, which is the fact that the country has been under devastating U.S. sanctions for over a decade. To talk about economic collapse in the country and not actually refer to the impact of UN sanctions on the country is outrageous and is creating a perception that essentially only relief or aid from the U.S. or any other Western countries could simply help the country recover at this point. I think the level of the scale of damage to infrastructure in the country has a lot to do with the fact that for 10 years now, over 10 years, the country has not been able to have access to its own funds, has seen its economy halved or more due to the impact of U.S. sanctions, and is not able to even import basic things like cement. I think even being able to respond to this medically at this point, its health services are severely hampered by the lack of being able to import medical supplies. We've seen massive, damage across the country for 10 years. These earthquakes essentially come on top of 10 years of already extensive damage to the country.
Manolo.
So I think the right thing to do at this point is to call for not just aid, but to call for sanctions relief.
Okay, how patient then, Manolo, do you think Venezuelans will be? Many of them did celebrate when they saw Nicolas Maduro taken out. But if they see the U.S. response lacking and what you see as the accumulation of damage done over the 10 years of sanctions, do you think, I don't know, they could change their opinion or lose patience to the point of rejecting outright what the U.S. has done?
Well, I think that's actually not the most important question right now. I mean, I think people's perceptions of the U.S. could change variably based on what does happen over the next few days. But I think what the U.S. is deeply interested in, I think, is at this point seeing the perception of the Venezuelan government's response being changed, because a government that is not able to fully respond in this crisis because its hands are essentially tied by sanctions means that it will fare poorly in whatever electoral transition takes place in the next year or two. I think that that's sort of what the real scenario is at this point. Why does Venezuela have to only receive aid but not able to fully respond with its own resources and capacity, when those, in many cases, resources are frozen assets held in banks in the US, in the UK, and other parts of Europe?
Okay, Ivan, if you have thoughts, do go ahead. If not, I'd like to look more closely at Cuba.
I'd say very briefly, there's absolutely no doubt that the US sanctions had a huge role in gumming up the Venezuelan economy, making it incredibly difficult for its oil industry and helping to cause this massive exodus from the country. But let's also be clear that hyperinflation, which was in fact the original sin, if you like, of the Venezuelan economy under Chavismo, kicked in 2017, 2018. The very first sanctions imposed by the United States were only at the end of 2017. So, I mean, there is a shared responsibility for the economic collapse. There's no doubt about it. Now, since Delcy Rodriguez has come to power under US tutelage, there has been a series of additional licenses carved out for US firms in the oil industry primarily to operate. There have been some exemptions. The sanctions are being gradually rolled back, but under very close control of the United States. And I imagine we will see this process continue. But it's not a general lifting of sanctions. We're still quite a long way from that.
Okay. Then, Ivan, I'm going to stick with you because I do want to ask about Cuba, as mentioned, and ask how closely you think Cubans are watching Venezuela right now and how it's being, quote unquote, run by the United States in the wake of this disaster, as well as the taking of the oil revenues at present.
They are watching very closely. The fates of Cuba and Venezuela are intertwined. We've known that for some time. We knew that part of the Trump administration's interest in changing the government in Venezuela was denying that free oil, or rather subsidized oil, which Cuba was receiving, which was its lifeline for its energy supply. That since that was closed off after Maduro was captured, that Cuba has entered this terrible spiral of paralysis. Fundamentally, it doesn't have electricity. The transport has been affected. Hospitals, schools, the entire economy is effectively paralyzed. There's a whole lot of other sanctions piled on as well, and it's clear that the Trump administration, Rubio, would like to see what happened in Venezuela also happen in Cuba. A change in leadership, which then means that the United States has the power, the leverage to open up the economy, possibly open up the political system, give the Cuban American exiles their long-held wish that Cuba return to something like a democracy. I mean, it would take time, but that would be the long-term plan. I think what they will find is it's a different situation in Cuba. It's a much more solid regime, much more cohesive, much more ready to stand up to the United States. And the price is being paid by the Cuban people, who are in a terrible state of immiseration at the moment. And I would like to see the United States change tack and desist, if it were possible, from this ever-increasing coercion.
Yeah, Angie, Cuba is already one of the most heavily sanctioned countries on the planet. And now we have 5 more state-owned entities, some in mining, facing new sanctions. How much more does that actually strangle the Cuban government and the people? And how much does it serve exactly the ends that the United States wants right now?
Well, if you talk to the ambassador to the U.S. for Cuba, she would say something along the lines that she does want to find a way of working with the United States. She has said very publicly in the past that, they are seeking peace with the United States, their largest neighbor, and also that they would not attack Americans unless they were attacked first. And she has said that very publicly and to a lot of criticism, because right now they do feel like they're being attacked. There's massive energy shortages. Only, for a few hours a day are they able to even charge their phones or use light. And so it is a stranglehold. But earlier reports in the oil sanctions in Cuba, I remember hearing the State Department saying that they only have maybe a few more weeks left. Well, that's not the case, clearly. We're months from that. One of the things that we have to consider is that Cuba has their own oil supply as well. They can't refine it as quickly as they consume it, but they do have their own oil supply. So they're just dripping a lifeline for themselves. Most recently this month, the Cuban legislation created a reform where they're privatizing a lot of their banking systems and a lot of the country's economy systems just to protect themselves because they're afraid that it's going to go into a full collapse. So I think right now they're buying some time. Clearly, Marco Rubio wants to step in as soon as possible, but I think there is a way. And I'm hearing from the embassy in Washington, D.C. that they are in talks privately, but they're in talks.
Manolo, then you can pick up on that as well, but also tell me what you make of these free market reforms that we're now hearing about. It's the antithesis of Cuba's revolution. I imagine you feel they risk undoing whatever gains there were from socialist rule, mostly in eliminating that kind of massive inequality gap.
Actually, I'm not so worried about it undoing the gains of the revolution. I'm actually more worried about the fact that what forced the Cubans to have to even come to this point where they're taking these huge measures, these major reforms. I mean, the biggest or most drastic reforms since 1959, is essentially because the country's been strangled to the point where it has no other option. I mean, the US blockade for over 60 years has leveled the country's economy. The Cubans never got a fighting chance to even try to be sustainable or to be able to develop their economy in a way that fits their own needs. And at this point, which since December, only one ship of oil has arrived in Cuba. Only one ship. This is not normal, or it would not be acceptable for any other country on the planet. But because Cuba is under not just this naval blockade that is literally blocking oil from arriving to Cuba, but also military threats against its own existence, it was forced to try to make some measures, essentially to try to figure out, are there private means or private ways to ensure that the country can even make basic imports of food, of medicine, of even oil. At this point, the state is hampered from even making the most basic financial transactions because of U.S. foreign policy. And that ultimately should should cause outrage among people across the world. How can a government simply lead a genocidal policy against the Cuban people and get away with it?
Ivan, you can pick up on that and also help us better understand, I think, what really is being allowed under these private reforms that have now, or these private investment reforms as far as they're concerned. Do you feel that are you on Manolo's the same page, or do you think that it could potentially be a good thing for the Cuban economy?
I mean, it's the same issue which we talked about with Venezuela. What are the original failings of the government in the country in terms of, let's say, its economic management, the way it controls all political power and concentrates power under a sort of communist one-party state? And what is the fault of the United States for basically pressing, since the Cuban Revolution, for regime change, for bringing down the Communist Party and bringing down the Castro brothers? The thing about Cuba, of course, is that the two are basically fed off one another. The authoritarian state with a controlled economy has been justified by Cuban leaders because of the constant pressure from the United States, the covert and overt operations to overthrow the Cuban regime. And between these two, there seems to be almost no way out. Now we seem to be entering almost like a final endgame, possibly, because the conditions are so bad on the island. And I think we're seeing in Washington a government which is so clearly determined to pivot its military power towards the Caribbean, as it's done already with Venezuela, and take action against Cuba. And as I said, it's extremely worrying, because I don't know if the United States is going to get the outcome that they wish. It's very unlikely that this sort of pressure or even escalation into a military offensive is going to bring the Cuban people what they wish. And it would be the ideal moment, really, for those talks to reach some sort of breakthrough, the talks which Angie has mentioned. But what would be the shape? What would the Cuban government have to give up in terms of its sovereignty and its political constitution? And what would the United States be willing to give up in terms of its power over that country and its ability to decide its future? And I just hope that maybe as a result of this, this effort now in Venezuela to bring aid to the people of Venezuela who so badly need it, the United States may step back and think, well, what about the Cuban people? What about their needs as well? Let's stop putting them at making them the sort of scapegoat for whatever change that we need to see.
Yeah, we're down to our last minute, really. I mean, so Angie, I would need to get your perspective then on, quickly if you can, exactly what the United States wants out of Latin America, out of Cuba. Is it simply, I mean, you can be honest, is it economic exploitation, that there are business opportunities that the U.S. would like to have control of because it feels this is their backyard? Is it ideology, that it's tired of having had this last communist bastion on its own, on its doorstep? What is it that the U.S. really, truly wants to get here?
My read of this and talking to some of the leaders here in Miami that's very involved in this is that clearly President Trump and the administration wants a regime change, and so do the Cuban Americans here. They want to go home and they want to be able to invest in their homeland. So one of the early stages would be for Cuban Americans to be able to buy property in Cuba and letting them be the first round to invest in their country. So that is something that is in kind of the later stages of the talks. They're inviting U.S. companies now to look at Cuba very seriously, and certainly many multinationals based in the U.S. Have already taken trademark applications with the word Havana in it. So there's going to be some movements. We're going to see in the next few years that Cuba is going to open up business to the U.S.
Okay. Manolo, quickly, just 30 seconds for your final thoughts then.
No, I think more than just regime change, the U.S. wants to totally dominate Latin America, and it sees Latin America as its backyard. It wants to defend its backyard against what it sees as an existential threat from China in challenging its commercial hegemony in the region. And I think it's clearly said by Trump. He also doesn't want anyone who questions the dominance of the U.S. in the region, which is why Cuba and Venezuela have been clear targets. But we're also seeing major U.S. intervention in elections across the region.
That will have to be the final word for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists sincerely so much for being with me, and our viewers for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We will see you next time.